Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at a part of the world caught in, well, a pretty serious tug-of-war. Latin America.
hmm
From the Rio Grande all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. These nations are really feeling the squeeze. The United States and China are increasingly competing for influence there.
It's a huge dynamic, Chef.
Exactly. So our mission today is to try and understand how these countries are navigating these, well, tricky waters between these two global giants.
It's a fascinating tightrope walk, isn't it? I mean, imagine trying to balance the interests of two really powerful friends who definitely don't see eye to eye.
Right.
That's the spot many in Latin America are in right now. So to get a handle on their moves,
Yeah.
we really need to look at the playbooks, from both the U.S. and China.
And to see how the region's actually responding.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's unpack the United States playbook first.
Yeah.
It seems like a recent approach. It's been labeled coercive diplomacy.
Yeah, that term has come up quite a bit.
So if we break that down,
Yeah.
it's essentially using threats or pressure, economic, maybe military, to get other countries to do what you want.
That's the core idea, yes. And it's shown up in a few different ways in Latin America. For instance, there were some pretty strong statements suggesting the U.S. held, significant leverage over the region,
Implying dependence.
kind of implying that countries there needed the U.S. more than the U.S. needed them. That sort of sentiment, it seemed to set the tone for what came later.
And we saw some very specific examples of this pressure, didn't we? The Panama Canal thing definitely comes to mind.
Absolutely. That was quite something. Repeated claims that China was somehow operating the Panama Canal.
Which isn't accurate.
Not at all. The Panama Canal Authority has been fully in charge for over 2 decades, but there was even talk of the U.S. needing to take it back.
Wow.
And beyond that, the idea of potential U.S. military strikes inside Mexico against drug trafficking organizations was floated, almost suggesting a serious conflict.
That's quite a jump in rhetoric.
Yeah.
What about the economic side? This coercive diplomacy.
Yeah, we saw several examples there, too. Colombia, for instance, faced the threat of pretty big tariffs, like a 25% hike,
Why?
because it wouldn't allow certain U.S. military flights carrying deported migrants to land there.
Okay. And Mexico.
Mexico, too,
Yeah.
a major trading partner, obviously, hit with 25% tariffs on key sectors like steel, aluminum, and auto imports.
Ouch.
And then you had the sort of broader Liberation Day tariffs imposed on a whole range of Latin American and Caribbean countries.
What were those rates?
Generally a base rate of 10%, but even higher for specific countries the U.S. had issues with, like Nicaragua and Venezuela.
So it's clear the U.S. was wielding a pretty big stick, economically speaking. What's the underlying reason? What's the driver behind this assertive approach?
Well, the main concern seems to be China's rapidly growing economic influence in Latin America. It's undeniable.
How so?
Over the last, say, 20 years, China has just become a massive player there. A key trading partner for many, a huge source of foreign direct investment, FDI, and a really substantial lender.
Through things like the Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly. The BRI, that huge global infrastructure plan China launched, has been a major vehicle for this lending and investment in the region.
And the U.S. sees this as a challenge.
Absolutely. This expanding economic footprint is seen by Washington as a direct challenge to its historical dominance in the hemisphere and, a way for China to build up its soft power, too.
So it really boils down to pushing back against China's presence using economic muscle.
That appears to be a key plank of the strategy, yes. By using the leverage of these tariffs, these negotiations, the U.S. seems to be trying to pressure Latin American countries to, limit their dealings with China.
Kind of forcing a choice.
U.S. or China.
That seems to be the aim. Closer ties with us or deeper ties with Beijing. Pick one.
And Panama feels like a textbook case of this pressure working, doesn't it? It really does. Panama's experience is quite telling. So remember, they switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China back in 2017.
Right.
And soon after, they became the first Latin American nation to join the BRI. They were hoping, to attract Chinese investment, boost their role as a logistics hub because of the canal.
Makes sense.
But this move definitely drew criticism from the U.S. President Trump made some pretty pointed comments about the U.S. role in building the canal and China's growing influence there.
And then what happened?
Well, after some high-level U.S. engagement, Panama, well, it pulled back. It subsequently withdrew from the BRI.
Really?
Yes. And it also agreed to audit a port concession held by a Hong Kong-based company, and it started allowing U.S. troop rotations again.
So it looks like that pressure definitely had a tangible effect in Panama's case.
It certainly seems so.
But are there risks to this kind of approach? I mean, could it backfire on the U.S.?
Oh, definitely. There are absolutely risks involved. Look, the U.S. might get some short-term wins, some concessions, like with Panama. But this kind of arm twisting could really alienate other countries in the region and potentially actually push them closer to China in the long run.
Especially further south.
Especially in South America, yeah. Where the historical, economic, cultural ties to the U.S. are often, let's say, less intense compared to Central America or the Caribbean. Some might just see it as the U.S. putting its own interests first without much regard for its neighbors' needs or desires.
Right. Okay, so let's flip this around. Let's switch gears and look at China's response to all this U.S. pressure. What's their general strategy been?
China's approach, generally speaking, has been to offer trade and investment, often framed as having fewer conditions attached compared to, say, U.S. aid or investment.
Fewer strings attached.
That's the pitch, anyway. And they've explicitly warned countries against making deals with the U.S. if those deals exclude or restrict trade with China. They've hinted there could be negative consequences.
So actively countering the U.S. pressure.
Exactly. It highlights China's strategy. They're positioning themselves as a viable alternative, a counterweight to U.S. influence. They emphasize their huge market size and this appeal of their, quote, no strings attached model.
It sounds like China's very consciously trying to paint itself as the more, I don't know, reliable or maybe less demanding partner here?
Precisely. As the U.S. has leaned more towards protectionism at times, China keeps emphasizing open markets, for its goods.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw a really strong reaction from Beijing, actually, related to Panama again, when a U.S.-led group, including Blackwater, bought stakes in Panamanian ports from C.K. Hutchison.
What happened?
Beijing reacted pretty sharply, unusually sharp criticism in official Chinese media outlets. It showed a significant level of concern about, well, potential U.S. strategic moves and maybe disrupting key Chinese shipping routes through the canal.
So China clearly sees the Panama Canal as incredibly important strategically for its global trade. No surprise there, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely not. Their strong reaction just underscores how much strategic value they place on that waterway, and it shows they're increasingly willing to push back against U.S. influence in what Washington has long considered its own backyard.
And like you said earlier, maybe the U.S.'s heavy-handed tactics could inadvertently boost China's diplomatic standing?
It's possible. It allows China to sort of step in and portray itself as the more dependable, maybe less interventionist partner over the long haul. They're also quite aware, I think, that Latin American commodity exporters aren't likely to risk their access to the huge Chinese market without very significant benefits from the U.S. side.
It's such an intricate dance of power, isn't it? Okay, so now what about the countries actually caught in the middle, the Latin American nations themselves? How are they trying to navigate all this, these competing pressures from Washington and Beijing?
Well, many of them are trying to walk a very fine line. They're attempting to avoid fully siding with either the U.S. or China. Brazil is a great example. Brazil's adopted a strategy that people are calling strategic non-alignment. So even though Brazil is a key member of BRICS, and President Xi Jinping himself visited and invited Brazil to join the Belt and Road,
What did Lula do?
President Lula politely declined. He suggested instead that Brazil would be open to exploring cooperation, but only on, quote, mutually agreeable terms.
Interesting, a cautious approach.
Very cautious. It actually mirrors a similar stance India has taken towards some of China's big initiatives.
So this idea, strategic non-alignment, it seems really key to understanding how the region is responding. What are the main reasons behind it?
There are several factors, really. First, countries like Brazil, they want to keep balanced relationships with multiple global powers. The U.S., yes, but also the EU and China. They don't want to become overly dependent on just one.
Makes sense. Diversification.
Right. Second, there's often a preference for domestically driven investment and development using their own resources rather than relying too heavily on outside money, maybe especially from China.
Avoiding potential debt traps.
That's part of the calculation, yes. And third, even though trade ties with China are super strong for many, there's still a degree of strategic caution, a desire to protect their economic sovereignty, avoid too much influence. And it's worth noting, Mexico and Colombia, the next two biggest economies after Brazil, they've also engaged closely with China but haven't formally signed on to the BRI either.
Okay, so looking down the road, what are the most likely scenarios for how these countries will keep responding as this pressure potentially ramps up?
Well, the most probable scenario, I think, is that more countries will try to stick with this non-alignment strategy, basically trying to play the US and China off against each other.
To maximize their own benefit.
Exactly. Maximize benefits, keep their options open. And this approach could actually be particularly good for the more developed Latin American economies. It might help them grow more value-added industries, diversify away from just shipping raw materials to China.
But what if that middle ground becomes impossible? What if the pressure just gets too intense? Are there other possible paths?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That leads to a possible scenario. If the coercion, the pressure from both Washington and Beijing becomes overwhelming, countries might just feel forced to pick a side.
And who would likely go where?
Well, based on history, economics, culture, you'd probably see Mexico, the Dominican Republic, and most of Central America, maybe except Nicaragua, aligning more closely with the U.S.
Okay.
Conversely, most South American countries, plus Cuba and Nicaragua, they might lean more towards China. Their current economic ties, especially commodity trade, are often stronger with China now.
But it's not always clear-cut, is it?
No, definitely not. Countries like Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, they present much more complex situations because of their own unique political and economic realities. It's not a simple binary choice for everyone.
Understood.
You know,
And what's the least likely outcome here? What's the unlikely scenario?
a coordinated region-wide response,
Hmm.
a unified Latin American and Caribbean front. That seems the least probable.
Why is that?
Well, regional bodies in Latin America, like CELAC, they've historically been pretty weak, often plagued by overlapping memberships, different ideologies among leaders.
Right.
It's hard to get consensus.
We've seen examples of that, right?
Yeah. Think about the really muted response when Honduras called for a regional meeting about U.S. sanctions on Colombia, or the limited collective action when those region-wide U.S. tariffs were imposed. It just highlights how tough it is to get a united front.
Leaders pulling in different directions.
Exactly. You have some leaders actively trying to align with the U.S., others trying very hard not to provoke Washington, and still others leaning more towards China or just trying to stay out of it.
Yeah.
It really complicates any chance of a single cohesive regional strategy.
Right. So just to kind of bring this all together, we're seeing the U.S. using these pretty assertive coercive tactics to try and counter China's growing influence.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, China is offering what looks like, or is presented as, less conditional path trade investment.
Yeah, positioning itself as the alternative.
And stuck in the middle, you have the Latin American nations, mostly trying to maintain this really delicate balance of strategic non-alignment.
That's the main trend, yes.
But that possibility, that very real possibility of being forced to choose sides, it's definitely looming over them.
It is. That's a succinct way to put it. The fundamental question, really, is how these nations are going to navigate this intensifying pressure from both global powers while still protecting their own interests, their own autonomy, in the long run.
It certainly gives you, the listener, a lot to think about,
It's busy.
especially regarding the future path of Latin America and, frankly, its place in this rapidly changing global order. Thanks so much for breaking down such a complex situation for us.
My pleasure. It's a critical issue to watch.